Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Chapter 1. A Knock at Baker Street. It was a Thursday morning in early October, the sort of grey, damp London morning that seemed to dampen not only the streets but also the spirit. A pale fog hung low over the rooftops, seeping through the cracks of window panes and under doors, wrapping itself around the city like a muffler drawn too tight. I had risen early, as was my custom, and had settled down with a steaming cup of tea and the morning paper in the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. Holmes, of course, had been awake since dawn, ensconced in his chair and surrounded by a clutter of correspondence and monographs, all apparently relating to some obscure chemical compound he had been studying for the past 3 days. I had just reached the obituary column, a section Holmes, I might add, found particularly absorbing for its occasional links to crime and disappearance, when a sharp, urgent knock came at the front door. It was not the hesitant knock of the anxious client, nor the subdued tap of Mrs. Hudson's polite reminders. It was firm, decisive, and impatient. Holmes, without looking up from his chemical apparatus, muttered, "Lestrade, come in, Inspector." A moment later the door swung open, and sure enough in stepped Inspector G. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his bowler hat still damp with morning drizzle, and a grim expression shadowing his usually impassive features. "You do have the most infernal way of knowing who's behind a door," he said, brushing water from his coat. "Morning, Dr. Watson." "Good morning, Inspector," I replied, setting my cup aside. "What brings you here at this hour?" Holmes stood, stretching slightly as he turned from his table. "Not an abduction, no theft. A murder, I think, but not one in a drawing room or alley, or you'd not have come so quickly. A public scene. Unexpected." Lestrade blinked. "You're not wrong, Mr. Holmes. There's been a murder. Early this morning, or perhaps late last night. Quiet street, Mayfair district. Fellow found stabbed through the chest. No sign of a struggle, nothing taken, no witnesses, least none willing to say much." "And the name of the unfortunate?" Holmes asked. "Edmund Rook, solicitor, middle-aged, quite respectable. Known in legal circles, his body was discovered on Marlowe Street, just off Grafton Square. Clean part of town, nothing out of the ordinary. Ever happens there. Which is precisely why something now has," Holmes said with a faint glint in his eye. "If you were hoping to have the matter tidied up without too much fuss, I take it something about the scene has already struck you as off." Lestrade gave a reluctant nod. "There's something that doesn't sit right. The wound was clean, precise, and yet there's a sort of deliberateness to the way he was left. The body was half turned toward the lamppost, as though he were waiting for someone, or had been speaking to someone." "And no weapon found?" I asked. "None," Lestrade replied. "And his pocket watch was still on him, gold, untouched, as was his wallet, cash intact. So if it was a robbery, it was the most inefficient one I've ever seen." Holmes turned away, retrieving his coat from the hook near the fireplace. "Watson, your boots. I believe we'll find Marlowe Street has more to say than a corpse alone can tell." The fog clung to the city like a mourner's veil as our cab rattled through the winding streets of Westminster. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent for much of the journey, his brow furrowed, his gaze fixed beyond the fogged window pane, as if peering into some distant mental picture. "Do you already suspect foul play of a calculated kind?" I asked. "I suspect nothing," Holmes replied calmly. "I observe. Suspicion without observation is merely conjecture dressed in haste. What I do note is that this murder took place on a road where murders do not generally occur, That is its own anomaly, and anomalies, Watson, are the heartbeat of detection. Marlowe Street was as Lestrade had described it, a narrow, modest lane of smart, red brick houses with polished brass knockers and manicured shrubs standing sentinel by black-painted railings. The sort of street where curtains twitched, gossip simmered, and scandal rarely raised more than a whisper. The constable on duty recognized Lestrade immediately and stepped aside to let us pass the short cordon. The body had already been removed to the morgue, but the blood had not. A dark patch still stained the stones near the base of a street lamp, and a top hat sat several feet away, undisturbed. Holmes dropped to one knee beside the blood, examining the area with his magnifying glass. A few residents had gathered at their windows, but were quickly ushered away by another officer. "Do you see this?" Holmes asked, motioning me closer. "The blood is mostly pooled in one place, with only a slight trail, perhaps a few feet. The victim likely died where he fell, but look at the footprint beside the lamppost." I leaned in. A man's boot, heavy, worn at the heel. Exactly. That print faces the bloodstain, and it overlaps with a smaller, finer one that seems to have approached from the opposite direction. "Two people met here, then?" I asked. "Possibly, and yet only one set of retreating prints. The other ends here, meaning either the second man is the victim, which he isn't, or he stood still while something occurred." Holmes rose, brushing the dirt from his knees. "No sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds, you said, Lestrade?" "Correct. The doctor said the wound was made from the front, directly into the heart. Sudden death." "Then our murderer knew what he was doing," Holmes said. "Not an amateur, not panicked. This was quick, clean." A soft voice called out from a doorway. An elderly woman in a knitted shawl stepped out timidly. I heard voices last night," she said. "Late? 11:30 perhaps?" One of the men laughed. "Strange thing to hear on a night like that." Holmes turned. "Did you see them, madam?" "No, sir. Only shadows." I peeked through the curtain, but the fog was thick. One of them seemed to be wearing a long coat, the taller one. Holmes thanked her kindly, and then turned to Lestrade. "The streets may be quiet, Inspector, but I believe Marlowe Street is about to become the most interesting corner of London." Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The morning had deepened into a grey, drizzly afternoon when Holmes, Lestrade, and I returned to Marlowe Street to examine the crime scene more thoroughly. Though the body was gone, the air still seemed heavy with the lingering shadow of violence. A few curious residents lingered behind drawn curtains, whispering quietly among themselves, but the street itself was otherwise deserted, except for the steady drizzle that blurred the edges of the cobblestones and slicked the brick walls with a faint sheen. Holmes walked the length of the lane slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sharp and observant. His methodical pace reminded me of a scholar at his library, absorbing every detail as if each brick and blade of grass held a piece of the larger puzzle. "Notice the lamppost here," Holmes said, stopping beside the black iron standard where the old woman had seen the shadowed figures. The lamp was unlit now, but faintly fragrant with the residue of burnt oil. He knelt to the base, scrutinizing the pavement in its vicinity with his magnifying glass. The victim was found only a few feet from this point, which means the encounter that led to his death took place under poor light. The killer must have been confident or desperate. Lestrade frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The doctor mentioned a knife, but we found no blade on the scene. How did he dispose of it?" "Either it was taken by the murderer or hidden very well," Holmes replied, "but there is no sign of disturbance beyond this point. If the killer did not take the weapon, then he must have discarded it before arriving or after fleeing the scene." I bent closer to the ground. Look at these faint smudges on the paving stones, Holmes. They seem like traces of fabric. Excellent observation, Watson. These marks are consistent with the dragging of a cloth, perhaps a sleeve or scarf, caught briefly on the uneven cobblestones. The direction suggests the cloth was pulled away from the lamppost toward the southern end of the street. Holmes stood, dusting his knees as he glanced down Marlowe Street, which fits with the footprints we noticed yesterday. One man approaching, one retreating, and something, a clue, left behind. Lestrade turned to a nearby lamppost and indicated a small piece of fabric caught under its base. "I almost missed this," he said, plucking it carefully. "It's a strip of purple silk." Holmes took it and held it between his fingers. "A curious find. Purple silk is neither common nor cheap. This is not a rag torn from a common man's coat." I glanced toward the neat, respectable houses that lined the street. Who in Marlowe Street would carry such an accessory? "That is what we must discover," Holmes said, tucking the silk into a small evidence bag. Our examination was interrupted by a sudden voice. A gentleman, evidently a resident, had come out of his house, observing us with cautious curiosity. "I'm Mr. Henley, of number 14, he introduced himself, his voice steady but curious. "Might I be of some assistance?" Holmes studied the man with interest. Henley was a middle-aged man, tall and slim, dressed in an immaculate three-piece suit and a waistcoat embroidered with a subtle pattern. His manner was polite, yet brisk. "We are grateful for any information," Holmes said. "Were you aware of Mr. Rook's presence in this neighborhood?" Henley nodded. "Indeed, I have known Mr. Rook for some years. He was a solicitor by profession, but a quiet one. No enemies that I knew of." "Did you notice anything unusual last evening?" Lestrade asked. Henley hesitated. "Now that you mention it, there was something. I heard voices coming from the end of the street near the lamppost shortly before midnight. 2 men, I believe." "Could you distinguish their words?" I inquired. "Not clearly, but there was laughter, an oddly cheerful sound, quite out of place on a night as bleak as last. I cannot say why, but it disturbed me. One of the voices was deeper, more commanding, the other lighter, perhaps younger." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Henley. Did you see the men?" "No, I only glimpsed shadows. It was too dark and foggy." Holmes turned back toward the street. "A meeting by the lamppost, laughter, and yet a murder shortly after. Curious contrast." As Henley returned indoors, Holmes began pacing again. "Watson, Lestrade, the victim's death was sudden and violent, but it was preceded by a meeting that to an observer seemed convivial. What could have shifted so rapidly between laughter and a fatal stab?" Lestrade shook his head. I'm puzzled." Holmes considered the strip of purple silk in his hand once more. "This, I believe, may be our most telling clue. A man's accessory, torn during a struggle or hurried exit. But where does it lead?" "Could it belong to the victim?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Not likely. Mr. Rook's pockets were searched thoroughly. Nothing of the sort was found on him. This was left behind by another party." Just then, a commotion down the street drew our attention. A constable was escorting a tall, somewhat disheveled young man toward us, his red hair unmistakable even beneath the wet mist. "I'm the cabbie who drove the 2 men last night," the man said breathlessly. "I might be able to help." Holmes motioned him forward. "Pray, tell us all you saw." The man, whose name tag read George Finch, caught his breath before speaking. "I picked up 2 gentlemen near Piccadilly around 11 o'clock. One was a tall, dark-haired man, quite serious. The other had bright red hair, wore a grey cloak, and seemed very agitated. They asked to be taken near Grafton Square, but then stopped near Marlowe Street. They got out and talked for a bit near the lamppost." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And then?" "They argued, sir. I could hear the words, though not all, something about trust and lies. The red-haired man stormed off while the dark one stayed behind. Then I heard a cry. Lestrade exchanged a look with Holmes. "And you saw no one else?" "Only the two. The red-haired fellow was furious. He vanished down Grafton Square. I stayed to see what happened, but, well, you know the rest." Holmes pondered this quietly. Two men, an argument, a sudden outburst of violence, and the red-haired man fled. Yet the purple silk remains. What binds these threads together? I could see Holmes was piecing together the scene in his mind, each detail, no matter how trivial, becoming a thread in the tapestry of a murder mystery that was far from straightforward. "We must discover the identities of these men," Holmes concluded, "and what it was they were arguing about." The fog deepened around us as the rain began to fall again, washing away footprints, erasing clues. But Holmes's mind was clear and steady, poised to unravel the tangled web that lay before him on Marlowe Street. Chapter 3. The Victim. The morning after our extended investigation on Marlowe Street, Holmes and I found ourselves back in the familiar, cluttered rooms of 221B Baker Street. Lestrade had left us with a detailed report on the victim, and as usual, Holmes had been sifting through every available scrap of information with a surgeon's precision. Edmund Rook, the deceased, was indeed a man of respectable standing. A solicitor by profession, he had long been known in certain legal circles as a diligent, if somewhat reserved figure. Born in the provinces and having settled in London for the better part of 2 decades, he had earned a reputation for scrupulousness. A bachelor known for his meticulousness and lack of social entanglements, Rook seemed an unlikely target for murder. "Watson," Holmes said, spreading out a collection of papers and documents on the table, "we have here the usual directories, letters, and a modest ledger found on Rook's person. Nothing appears out of place, no personal letters of note, no evident scandal, but as always the absence of obvious motive is itself a motive for suspicion." I picked up one of the documents, a bill from a tailor dated just a week before his death, and a ticket stub to a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. Holmes nodded. "Exactly so. Now the concert ticket might seem trivial at first, but I suspect it holds a key." He motioned to a small silk strip I had not noticed before, lying neatly folded on top of the papers. "And this, Watson, a piece of fabric unlike anyone would expect on the coat of a solicitor." I took the fabric in my hand, smooth, fine silk of a deep plum colour, unmistakably of a gentleman's cravat. "It was found in his pocket?" "Yes, but it does not belong to him. His own garments were plain, practical, no trace of this colour or fabric anywhere else on his person." "It is curious." I looked up at Holmes. "What do you deduce from this?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers thoughtfully. "Mr. Rook was either in company, or recently so, with a man who wore this cravat. The plum colour is distinctive, not common, a gentleman who would not go unnoticed." I pondered this quietly. "Could it have been left accidentally during the struggle?" "Exactly, Watson. Either left behind in haste or torn off deliberately. There is something about this that suggests urgency and panic." As I considered this, Holmes's eyes gleamed with the characteristic spark of discovery. "Furthermore, the reports from Lestrade confirm no robbery. Wallet, watch, and papers intact. The attack was not for gain, but for silencing." I raised an eyebrow. "Silencing? Then what was Mr. Rook involved in?" "That is the mystery. Let us speak to those who knew him." Holmes had already arranged for us to visit a small office in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Rook had conducted much of his legal work. There, we met a young clerk, timid and nervous, who had worked under the solicitor for several months. "Mr. Rook was a man of strict habits," the clerk told us. "He kept his affairs private, but he did mention something troubling him of late." He said he was to meet a man that night, and that the meeting could decide the fate of a certain trust. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly on the table. A trust, you say? Yes, sir. A considerable trust fund belonging to a nobleman recently deceased. Mr. Rook was a trustee, along with two others, I believe. Holmes glanced at me. A matter of considerable sums and delicate responsibility, and therein a possible motive. But who would wish him dead over it? I asked. That, Watson, is what we must discover. Our next visit was to the funeral parlour where Rook's belongings were being catalogued. Among his personal effects, Holmes found a monogrammed handkerchief, faintly scented with a perfume both floral and elusive. The monogram was intertwined initials, R and L, which did not correspond to the victim's name. Another clue, Holmes remarked. A woman's, no doubt, Watson, but whose? The following morning, we went to a tailor's shop in Mayfair, a discreet establishment renowned for its bespoke garments. Holmes showed the proprietor the plum silk, inquiring after its buyer. "Ah, that is a rare shade," the man said, rubbing his chin. "Only one customer recently purchased such fabric for a cravat, Mr. Lionel Vane, the violinist." "Vane?" Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "And you know where to find him?" "Indeed. He lives in the Mayfair district, not far from Marlowe Street." Holmes and I proceeded at once to the address provided. The house was modest but tasteful, and as we were admitted, a sense of restrained tension hung about the rooms. Mr. Lionel Vane was a man in his early 40s, slender and precise, with sharp features and a quick, guarded smile. He welcomed us politely, but with a certain wariness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, to what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Vane, we understand you own a plum cravat recently purchased, is that correct?" Vane's fingers instinctively went to his neck, where a rather plain cravat was indeed tied. "My wife bought me several such pieces," he said cautiously. "I rarely wear that colour, if I'm honest. It does not suit me." Holmes studied him closely. "Your wife, madam?" "Yes." Amelia Vane. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "May we speak with her?" After a brief wait, Mrs. Amelia Vane appeared, a pale, elegant woman with watchful, calculating eyes. She greeted us with the grace of a practiced hostess, but I could not help noticing the slight tremor in her hand as she poured tea. Holmes's questions were measured and deliberate, probing their acquaintance with Mr. Rook. Mrs. Vane insisted she did not know him personally, yet Holmes's keen eye detected inconsistencies in her answers, hesitations, fleeting glances, a subtle tightening of the lips. As we took our leave, Holmes whispered, "She does not wish to admit what she knows. There is fear, yes, but also something more." "Guilt, perhaps?" I glanced at Holmes, puzzled. "Guilt? For what?" "That, my dear Watson, we shall soon discover." Back in Baker Street that evening, Holmes resumed his analysis of the case. The purple silk, the whispered fears, the mysterious trust, each detail a thread in a growing web of intrigue. "Watson," he said, "the motives of murder are many, but none so potent as those involving money, secrecy, and betrayal. We must now follow this lead into the lives of Mr. Vane and his wife. They, it seems, may hold the key to what transpired on Marlowe Street." As the gaslight flickered in the room, casting long shadows upon the walls, I could not help but feel that the heart of the mystery was drawing near, yet still elusive, waiting for Holmes's unparalleled reasoning to bring it into the light. Chapter 4. The Vane's Secret. The morning was heavy with a persistent drizzle as Holmes and I made our way back to the Vane's residence in Mayfair. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of urgency, though Holmes maintained his usual composure, his sharp eyes ever observant of the passing faces and the muted bustle of the London streets. "Watson, he began quietly as we entered the cab. "There is an unspoken tension about this case that does not lie solely with the murder. The Vane's evasiveness hints at a secret too delicate to surface easily, and secrets, when combined with money and influence, are often a catalyst for violence." I nodded but remained silent, my thoughts racing with the details already collected. The purple silk cravat, the trust fund, the unknown handkerchief bearing intertwined initials, each was a thread waiting to be woven into the final tapestry. As we arrived, the Vane's house appeared even more forbidding in the pale morning light. The front door was opened by a young maid who eyed us with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Mr. and Mrs. Vane are expecting you, sir," she said softly, leading us into a drawing room that was finely furnished, yet carried an air of restraint. The heavy curtains were drawn, and the faint smell of lavender mingled with the dampness from outside. Mrs. Amelia Vane entered soon after, her face composed but paler than I had remembered. Mr. Lionel Vane followed shortly, his expression guarded but less defensive than the previous day. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Mrs. Vane began, inclining her head. "I trust you will understand if we are cautious. The events of recent days have unsettled us greatly." Holmes inclined his head courteously. "Madam, it is precisely because of these events that I must ask you to be as candid as possible." Mrs. Vane glanced toward her husband before speaking. "My husband and Mr. Rook had been involved in the management of the trust fund, yes, but recent developments threaten to unravel everything." Holmes leaned forward. "What sort of developments?" Mr. Vane spoke for the first time. "There was a dispute over the rightful beneficiaries. Mr. Rook discovered discrepancies in the accounts, suggesting that some funds had been diverted, illegally, I might add. He confronted me and wished to bring the matter before the other trustees." Mrs. Vane's hands clenched briefly in her lap. It was a delicate situation. If the matter became public, it would ruin all of us, financially and socially. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "A motive, then, for silencing Mr. Rook before he could act?" "Precisely," Mr. Vane replied grimly, "but I assure you we had no wish for harm to come to him." Holmes's gaze did not waver. Yet harm did come, and it came in Marlowe Street, in the dead of night. The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece. "May I ask," Holmes continued, "about your whereabouts on the night of the murder?" Mrs. Vane hesitated, then answered, "We were attending a social gathering in Piccadilly until late. I left early due to a headache. Lionel returned home around midnight. Can anyone corroborate this?" Lestrade, who had joined us, inquired. Mrs. Vane nodded. "Several guests remember me leaving early. As for Lionel, I'm afraid there is no one to confirm his precise time of return." Holmes steepled his fingers. A convenient alibi, perhaps. The tension in the room was palpable. "I understand your position, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Vane said, "but I implore you to consider that there may be others with darker motives." "Who, for example?" Holmes asked. "Mr. Rook had enemies. The solicitor was not as quiet as he appeared. There were whispers of a scandal involving forged documents and blackmail. If such rumors are true, they might lead us away from personal disputes toward more dangerous territory." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade, then nodded. "Indeed, a web of deceit grows ever more complex." After a pause, Holmes turned his attention to a small writing desk where a sealed envelope lay unopened. "I understand you found this among Mr. Rook's possessions?" Holmes asked Mrs. Vane. "Yes, it was addressed to a J.L., a name none of us recognize." Holmes carefully broke the seal and withdrew the letter. The handwriting was neat, but hurried. "To J.L., he read aloud. "The matter of the trust must be resolved before the fortnight's end, or consequences will follow. I have evidence that will secure my position. Meet me if you wish to avoid ruin." Blackmail. M. Lestrade muttered. Holmes nodded. Or a desperate attempt at leverage. Have you any idea who J.L. might be? I asked. Mrs. Vane shook her head. No one known to us. Holmes folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocket. Then we have another mystery to solve. The identity of J.L. and his or her connection to the trust and the victim. As we took our leave, Holmes paused at the door and cast a long look back at the Vanes. Remember this, Watson, he said quietly. When dealing with secrets and trust, one must always expect betrayal, and sometimes the closest allies are the most dangerous enemies. Outside, the rain had ceased, but the street remained slick and dark. Shall we visit this J.L. next? I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. Indeed, Watson, the dance is just beginning, and every step brings us closer to the truth. Chapter 5. The Enigmatic Correspondent. The investigation had now spiraled into a web of tangled relationships and hidden motives. The letter addressed to J.L. was a key that might unlock the mystery, but the identity of the correspondent remained a baffling enigma. Holmes, as always, had his mind whirring with possibilities. We decided to begin our search with London's directory and a thorough canvassing of the legal and social circles connected to Mr. Edmund Rooke. Baker Street was unusually quiet that morning, the usual bustle of the city subdued under a pale sun that barely penetrated the overcast sky. Holmes sat at his desk, sifting through the city's registries, cross-referencing names and addresses. The letter's neat handwriting was a useful clue. It suggested a person educated, accustomed to writing carefully, perhaps accustomed to secrecy. J.L., Holmes murmured, a pair of initials that might belong to any one of 100 persons, but none irrelevant to the case. Have you made any progress, Holmes? I asked, as I arranged the scattered papers on the table. Some, Watson. Notice the letter's ink, a peculiar shade of violet, which is rare. It is an ink used primarily by a single stationer in Covent Garden. We must visit the shop. We set out without delay, the city streets slick with the morning dew. The Covent Garden stationer's was a small, discreet shop, cluttered with papers and inks of every hue. The proprietor, an elderly gentleman with keen eyes, welcomed Holmes with mild curiosity. Holmes produced a small sample of the violet ink from the letter and asked the proprietor if he recalled the purchaser. The man studied the sample and nodded slowly. Yes, indeed. A gentleman came in last week, quite particular about the shade, paid in cash and left a forwarding address in Bloomsbury. Holmes's eyes brightened. Bloomsbury, then, we shall investigate further. Our visit to Bloomsbury revealed a modest townhouse where a Mrs. Julia Lawrence lived, a woman of middle years, apparently a widow. We found her in the parlour, her hands folded demurely, as she received us with polite surprise. Mrs. Lawrence, I presume? Holmes began. She inclined her head. Yes, sir. How may I assist you? Holmes did not mince words. You recently corresponded with Mr. Edmund Rooke? Mrs. Lawrence's eyes flickered for a moment. Yes, though our acquaintance was recent. Would you mind telling us the nature of your correspondence? Mrs. Lawrence hesitated, then spoke in a low, careful voice. Mr. Rooke had been helping me with certain legal matters regarding my late husband's estate. There were complications, unresolved disputes about trust funds and heirs. I wrote to him seeking advice, and he replied. Did your correspondence ever hint at threats or blackmail? Holmes asked. She shook her head. No, nothing of the sort. Mr. Rooke was professional and kind, but I fear someone else may have used my name. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Is it possible, Mrs. Lawrence, that you are the J.L. mentioned in the letter? She seemed taken aback. I had not considered that, but I am certain I'm not involved in any wrongdoing. Holmes nodded slowly. Of course. But tell me, did anyone else have access to your letters? She thought for a moment. My housekeeper sometimes collects my mail. She is trustworthy, but others in London are not always so honest. Holmes made a note in his journal. We shall speak with your housekeeper shortly. As we left Mrs. Lawrence's house, I remarked on the delicate balance Holmes maintained between gentle inquiry and subtle pressure. His manner coaxed the truth without offence, a skill I deeply admired. Back at Baker Street, Holmes studied the letter again by lamplight, and his mind began piecing the puzzle. The letter was sent to Mrs. Lawrence, Holmes said thoughtfully, but the tone and content suggest a man accustomed to power and menace. The threat was clear: settle the trust or face ruin. But Mrs. Lawrence says she was unaware of such threats, I pointed out. That is not uncommon, Holmes replied. Often a third party uses a legitimate correspondent as a shield for their own machinations. Our next step was to visit the housekeeper, a woman named Martha Gill, who lived not far from Mrs. Lawrence's residence. Holmes and I approached her small lodgings on a quiet street, and Martha answered the door cautiously. Yes, she asked, her voice wary. Holmes introduced himself and explained our inquiries. Martha's eyes flickered with unease. I did collect the letters, yes, she admitted, but I swear I never read them. I just delivered them. Holmes's gaze was sharp. And did anyone ever ask you about Mrs. Lawrence's correspondence? Did anyone try to intercept her mail? Martha hesitated. There was a man, a stranger, who came around recently asking questions about Mrs. Lawrence. He was polite but insistent, and I felt uneasy. Did you recognize him? I asked. Number? He wore a dark coat and hat, kept his face turned away most of the time. Holmes was thoughtful. An unknown visitor asking questions about the letters, this could be the very source of the threat. Before we could pursue this lead further, a telegram arrived at Baker Street. Lestrade had found a clue. A witness in Marlowe Street had come forward claiming to have seen a suspicious figure near the scene of the crime, someone matching the description of the dark-coated man Martha described. Holmes's eyes lit with that unmistakable gleam. The plot thickens, Watson, he said. Our unknown interrogator and the murder are undoubtedly linked. The witness, a lamplighter, described seeing a man pacing near the lamppost where Mr. Rook fell. The figure seemed agitated, constantly glancing over his shoulder. This man, the lamplighter said, carried a small, leather-bound notebook. Could it be a ledger of some kind? Lestrade wondered. Likely, Holmes agreed, a record of debts, threats or payments. As evening fell, Holmes paced his sitting room, absorbing every detail. We are closing in, Watson, he said quietly. The letter to Mrs. Lawrence was a red herring, or rather a deliberate misdirection. The real enemy hides behind layers of deceit, using shadows to mask his hand. But who could wield such influence and such cruelty? I asked. Holmes's gaze grew distant but determined. Someone desperate to keep a secret buried, a secret that would shatter reputations and fortunes alike. We both knew that the coming days would bring confrontation, revelations, and perhaps danger. Yet with Holmes at the helm, I had no doubt the truth would emerge as inevitably as the dawn follows the darkest night. Chapter 6. Shadows in the Night. The city had taken on a chill by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps flickering in the early dusk, casting long shadows on the wet pavements. Despite the biting cold, my mind was restless, buzzing with the fragments of the case we had uncovered so far. The murder of Edmund Rook was no simple crime of passion or chance. It was rooted deep in the shadows of power, deceit, and desperation. Holmes, as ever, was serene, his mind a steel trap, working tirelessly to fit the pieces into a coherent whole. Watson, he said quietly as we entered 221B, our inquiries have uncovered layers of subterfuge. The presence of the mysterious letter, the unknown man asking questions, and now this shadowy figure with the leather-bound notebook, it all points to an intricate scheme. I settled into my chair, warming my hands on a cup of tea. What is our next move, Holmes? Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as if reaching into the recesses of his memory. We must look beyond the obvious. The man with the notebook is more than a mere visitor. He is a player in a dangerous game. Before I could ask more, there was a sudden rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a folded newspaper. "Mr. Holmes, you might find this of interest," she said. Holmes took the paper and scanned the headline. "Forgery scandal threatens to topple high society. Solicitor found dead in mysterious circumstances." The article detailed a growing scandal involving forged documents tied to a trust fund, implicating several prominent figures. It also noted that Edmund Rook had been investigating the matter and was found murdered shortly after. Watson Holmes said the public is beginning to catch wind of the true nature of this crime. The pressure is mounting on those involved. We spent the evening reviewing the evidence once more. Holmes's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table as he recounted the facts. Edmund Rook was a solicitor and trustee of a considerable trust fund. He discovered irregularities suggesting forgery and misappropriation. He received threats, evidenced by the letter to Mrs. Lawrence. An unknown man, described as dark-coated and secretive, was seen near the murder scene. The Vanes had motives tied to the trust fund, but their alibis seemed shaky. Yet, Holmes mused, there is something missing. The motive is there, the players identified, but the means, the how and why of the murder, remain elusive. Holmes rose and walked to the window, staring out at the rainy street. "Watson, have you considered the placement of the body on Marlowe Street?" I shook my head, only that it was near a gas lamp, suggesting the killer wanted the body found quickly. Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely, but the victim's position tells us more. He was placed deliberately, feet pointing toward the west, as if to send a message." "A message?" I echoed, intrigued. Holmes nodded. "In certain circles, the orientation of a body can signify a warning. Here, it suggests the murderer wished to implicate or threaten someone in the Western District, perhaps another trustee or conspirator." The following day, Holmes and I revisited Marlowe Street, examining the exact spot where Rook was found. The gas lamp stood as it had that night, flickering faintly. Holmes inspected the ground closely, his magnifying glass revealing faint shoe prints and a peculiar residue. A fine powder scattered near the base of the lamppost. "Camphor," Holmes murmured. "Used to mask scents or as an irritant. The murderer likely spread this to confuse any tracking dogs." Holmes's eyes gleamed with renewed purpose. They were cautious, but not cautious enough. As we continued, a sharp cry interrupted our examination. A young boy, no older than 10, approached us hurriedly, clutching a small bundle of papers. "Sir, I found these near the lamp," he said breathlessly, handing the bundle to Holmes. Holmes unfolded the papers with deliberate care. They were pages torn from a ledger, documenting suspicious financial transactions linked to the trust fund. "This is invaluable," Holmes said softly. "It appears our murderer, or their accomplice, left a trail after all." Returning to Baker Street, Holmes spread the ledger on the table and began cross-referencing the names with those we had already encountered. "Look here, Watson," he said, pointing to several entries. "Payments made to unknown recipients, some under aliases. It is clear that funds were diverted systematically." Holmes paused, then added, "One name recurs frequently, J.L. This confirms our earlier suspicion that the letter was not a red herring, but part of a wider network." The evening deepened as Holmes made several notes, his face unreadable. I could sense the gears turning rapidly, assembling the final pieces. Suddenly Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, we must confront Mrs. Lawrence and the Vanes again. There is more beneath their calm facades than they admit." As we prepared to leave, I asked, "Holmes, do you suspect one of them is the murderer?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Suspect, yes, but proof eludes us. The truth often hides where we least expect it." Our return to Mayfair was tense. Mrs. Lawrence greeted us with a nervous smile, while the Vanes' home was quiet, the usual tension thickening the air. Holmes's questions grew sharper, his eyes penetrating. "Mrs. Lawrence, this ledger suggests a close connection between your late husband's estate and the misappropriated funds. How do you explain this?" Mrs. Lawrence faltered. I was unaware. My husband's affairs were complex. I only recently learned of irregularities." Holmes did not press immediately. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Vane. "Madam, your husband has been linked to several payments under an alias. Care to explain?" Mrs. Vane's composure wavered. "I do not know what you mean." Holmes smiled coldly. "The ledger says otherwise." Mr. Vane intervened, voice rising. "This is a witch hunt. We are innocent." Holmes raised a hand. "Calm yourself, Mr. Vane. Innocence will be proven or disproven by facts, not anger." The confrontation ended with no resolution, but Holmes's gaze lingered thoughtfully on Mrs. Lawrence. Later that evening, as I sat in the sitting room, Holmes approached me quietly. "The dance continues, Watson," he said. "We are circling the heart of the mystery. Soon the shadows will part, and we shall see the truth." Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. The fog hung low over London as Holmes and I set out once again, the damp air mingling with the faint scent of coal smoke and the muffled clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. The case had taken on a sinister dimension, one that reached beyond mere financial deceit into realms of deep personal betrayal. Holmes had been silent for much of our journey, his mind clearly engaged in restless calculation. When he spoke, it was with a rare urgency that commanded attention. "Watson," he said, "the ledger we uncovered is a vital clue but incomplete. There are gaps, deliberate omissions no doubt, meant to protect the mastermind. If we are to unmask our murderer, we must press deeper into the social circles of those implicated." Our first destination was a discreet gentlemen's club in Pall Mall, where several trustees of the trust fund were known to gather. The club was the very embodiment of Victorian exclusivity. Dark mahogany walls lined with leather-bound volumes, flickering gaslights casting a warm glow, and an air thick with tobacco and whispered confidences. Holmes and I entered with cautious steps, mindful of the eyes that tracked our movements. After introductions and some polite inquiries, we managed to secure a private audience with Charles Beaumont, a senior trustee known for his sharp tongue and acerbic wit. "Mr. Holmes," Beaumont greeted, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Beaumont, I seek your counsel regarding the recent tragic death of Edmund Rooke and the irregularities in the trust fund accounts." Beaumont's expression darkened. "Rooke was a meddlesome fellow, meddling where he had no business. His death was unfortunate, but the truth is more complicated than you imagine." Holmes leaned forward. "Complicated how? Financial mismanagement? Blackmail? Or something more personal?" Beaumont snorted. "All of the above, I'm afraid. There are those who would go to any lengths to protect their interests. Some have much to lose." Holmes fixed him with a piercing look. "Names, Mr. Beaumont. I require names." Beaumont hesitated, then muttered, "There is talk of a certain Mr. Lionel Vane. His family's fortune is entwined with the trust, and there have been whispers of secret meetings and heated arguments." This confirmed Holmes's earlier suspicions. And Mrs. Vane? Beaumont shrugged. Amelia is a shrewd woman, but in these matters men often take the lead. Holmes gave a faint smile. Yet the women are seldom innocent. The conversation was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of a courier bearing a sealed envelope for Holmes. He broke the seal and scanned the contents rapidly. A note from Lestrade Holmes said Ennie has uncovered something intriguing in the victim's personal effects. A second letter, this one addressed to a CBI, raised an eyebrow. Charles Beaumont? Holmes nodded. The plot thickens. We left the club with a new lead and a growing sense of unease. The duplicity within the trust fund was far more widespread than we initially believed. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes examined the second letter. It was terse, almost threatening, demanding silence and discretion concerning the ledger's contents. There is a game of shadows here, Watson, Holmes mused. Each player fearful of exposure, each willing to betray the other to save their own skin. The following day, we paid a visit to Charles Beaumont's residence, a grand townhouse in Mayfair. Beaumont was absent, but his housekeeper was forthcoming. Mr. Beaumont has been acting strangely of late, she confided. He often receives visitors at odd hours, and there have been heated discussions in his study. Holmes nodded. We shall keep this in mind. Returning to the street, Holmes paused. Watson, it is time we revisit the Vanes. We found the couple once more at their residence. This time, Holmes's approach was more incisive. Mrs. Vane, Holmes began, the ledger links your husband to payments under the alias CB. Can you explain this? Mrs. Vane's calm fractured. I do not know what you mean. Holmes pressed on. The ledger, the letters, the threats, all point to a conspiracy involving you, your husband, and Mr. Beaumont. Mr. Vane intervened, his voice strained. You have no proof. This is slander. Holmes regarded him coolly. Proof comes with patience, but motives and means are evident. Mrs. Vane broke down in tears. It was meant to be secret. We tried to protect the family name. Edmund threatened to expose everything unless we paid. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And so you silenced him? No, I swear it was not me. Holmes's gaze shifted to Mr. Vane. And you? Mr. Vane looked away. I was not present that night. I arrived home late and found him dead. Holmes considered this. Yet the witness saw a man with a leather notebook nearby, someone who knew the details intimately. The Vanes exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Lawrence, Holmes continued, you claimed ignorance of the threats. Yet your letters and the ledger suggest otherwise. Mrs. Lawrence's face paled. I was only trying to protect what was left of my late husband's estate. Holmes's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes, Mrs. Lawrence, protection leads to unintended consequences. The room fell silent, tension thick as London fog. Holmes turned to me quietly. Watson, we are nearing the heart of this matter. The tangled web of deceit is slowly unraveling. Just then a sharp knock echoed from the hallway. Lestrade entered, his face grim. We've had a break, he announced. A man matching the description of the dark-coated stranger has been found, attempting to flee the city. Holmes's eyes gleamed. This may be the key to our puzzle. As Lestrade detailed the arrest, Holmes's mind raced with the implications. The stranger was none other than Charles Beaumont himself, attempting to escape with evidence that would implicate the Vanes and Mrs. Lawrence. The gathering storm had broken. Chapter 8. The Unveiling of Truth. The early morning mist clung to the streets as Holmes, Lestrade and I assembled at Scotland Yard's interview room. Charles Beaumont sat across from us, his once imperious bearing reduced to thinly veiled desperation. The air was heavy with anticipation. We were at the brink of unraveling the mystery that had cast such a long shadow over Marlowe Street. Holmes, with his usual serene composure, began. Mr. Beaumont, you attempted to flee London, knowing the walls were closing in. Your actions speak volumes, but the truth demands more than flight. Beaumont's eyes darted, but he said nothing. Holmes continued. You orchestrated the forgery scandal, diverting trust funds into secret accounts under various aliases, including CB and JL. When Edmund Rook uncovered the irregularities and threatened exposure, you sought to silence him permanently. Lestrade nodded sharply. We found the ledger concealed in your home, along with correspondence linking you to the anonymous threats. Beaumont's face paled. I did what I had to do to protect my family's legacy. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Yet it was your own hand that wielded the dagger. The room fell into tense silence. Then, to my astonishment, Holmes stood and beckoned us to follow. We shall visit the scene of the crime, he said. There are truths still buried where shadows fall. The walk to Marlowe Street was quiet, but electric, with unspoken tension. Holmes moved with purpose to the very gas lamp where Rook's body had been found. Notice, Holmes said, pointing to the pavement, the faintest impression here, an indentation, barely visible but significant. He knelt, brushing away dirt and debris, revealing a small metallic fragment, a cufflink adorned with an intricate family crest. Mr. Beaumont's cufflinks, Holmes remarked dryly. One was lost during the struggle. Beaumont's composure shattered. I did not mean for it to end like this, Holmes continued. Your plan was cunning but flawed. You underestimated the persistence of Mr. Rook and the astuteness of those who seek justice. Lestrade produced a small leather notebook, matching the one described by the lamplighter. This, Holmes explained, is the ledger of deceit. Its pages reveal your financial manipulations, the names of co-conspirators, and the timeline leading to the murder. Beaumont slumped, defeated. Holmes then addressed the assembled officers and witnesses. Though Mr. Beaumont bears primary responsibility, others were complicit. The Vanes, seeking to shield their inheritance, conspired with him. Mrs. Lawrence, caught between loyalty and fear, attempted to mediate. I asked quietly, Holmes, how did you discern these connections so clearly? Holmes smiled faintly. Observation, Watson, and deduction. The violet ink led us to Mrs. Lawrence's correspondence. The ledger's irregularities pointed to aliases, which brought us to Beaumont and the Vanes. The cufflink at the crime scene was the final piece. He paused, eyes distant but resolute. Each clue was a thread. The fabric of the truth revealed itself only when woven together. As Beaumont was led away in handcuffs, Holmes turned to me. Another case concluded, Watson. Justice, though delayed, has been served. I sighed, the weight of the morning pressing upon me. And what of the letter to Mrs. Lawrence? Holmes folded his hands. A tool of misdirection, but also a cry for help. It showed us where the trail began. We left Marlowe Street behind, the city slowly waking from its fog-shrouded slumber. The case was closed, but the echoes of deception lingered, a reminder that beneath London's polished veneer lay secrets waiting for a mind like Holmes's to uncover.